cleaning the hull of a yacht just below the surface. The water darkened suddenly as if night had fallen, looking up to see a behemoth blocking out the sun. Panic set in as the massive creature drew closer. A tail the size of a car slammed into the yacht, thrown into open water face to face with a nightmare. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the ORCA ATTACK story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. The pre-dawn chill clung to Mateo's weathered skin as he made his way down to the small dock in Puerto Deseado. The seaside town was still asleep, save for a few fellow fishermen preparing their vessels for the day ahead. Mateo's boots creaked on the worn wooden planks, the sound mingling with the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. At 40 years old, Mateo Alvarez had spent more than half his life on these waters. The Patagonian Sea was both his provider and his tormentor, offering up bountiful catches on good days and threatening to swallow him whole on the bad ones. Today, he hoped, would be one of the good ones. As he approached his boat, the Esperanza, Mateo patted its faded blue hull affectionately. "Ready for another day, old friend?" he murmured, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The small 20-foot vessel had seen better days, but it was sturdy and reliable, much like Mateo himself. He began his pre-launch routine, checking the engine, fuel levels, and safety equipment with practiced efficiency. "Hey, Mateo," a gruff voice called out. Mateo looked up to see Carlos, a fellow fisherman, approaching with a thermos in hand. "Thought you could use some coffee before you head out." Mateo's face broke into a grateful smile. "Gracias, amigo. You're a lifesaver." Carlos poured the steaming liquid into a cup and handed it to Mateo. "The radio said there might be some chop out there today. You sure you want to go out alone?" Mateo took a long sip, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest. "Can't afford not to, Carlos. Elena needs braces, and Juan's university fees are due next month." He shrugged, a rueful expression crossing his face. "Besides, when has a little rough water ever stopped me?" Carlos clapped him on the shoulder. "Just be careful out there, eh? That new fishing company's been pushing everyone further out to sea. It's not like the old days." Mateo nodded, his expression hardening slightly. The arrival of the large commercial fishing operation had made life difficult for the local fishermen. Their massive trawlers swept through the traditional fishing grounds, leaving little for smaller operations like his. "Don't worry about me," Mateo assured his friend. "I know these waters better than I know my own home." As the first rays of sunlight began to paint the eastern sky, Mateo finished his preparations and untied the Esperanza from the dock. The small engine sputtered to life, and he guided the boat out of the harbor and into the open sea. The coastline of Patagonia stretched out before him, a rugged tapestry of cliffs and rocky beaches. Mateo breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the salty air. Despite the challenges, moments like these reminded him why he loved this life. An hour passed as Mateo navigated to his favorite fishing spot, an area where two currents met, often bringing with it a diverse array of marine life. He cut the engine and let the boat drift, the gentle rocking a familiar comfort. As he prepared to cast his nets, Mateo noticed a pod of dolphins in the distance, their sleek bodies arcing gracefully out of the water. It was a good sign. Where there were dolphins, there were usually fish. "Looks like we might have some luck today, Esperanza," Mateo said, patting the boat's side. He began to lower his nets, the weighted edges sinking quickly into the depths. The work was hard, requiring strength and skill to maneuver the heavy equipment. But Mateo's muscles knew the routine well, moving with a fluid efficiency born from years of practice. As the morning wore on, Mateo's optimism began to wane. The nets came up with less than he'd hoped for. A few hake, some mackerel, but nothing close to the haul he needed. "Come on," he muttered, scanning the horizon. "Where are you hiding?" The sun climbed higher, and Mateo wiped the sweat from his brow. The sea had become choppier, just as Carlos had warned. The Esperanza rocked more violently with each passing wave, making the work of hauling in and recasting the nets even more challenging. Mateo's arms ached and his back protested with each movement, but he pressed on, knowing that every fish could make a difference to his family's tight budget. As midday approached, Matteo noticed a change in the air. The wind had picked up, carrying with it a hint of something different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but years at sea had taught him to trust his instincts. He paused in his work, looking out across the now turbulent waters. The dolphins he'd seen earlier were long gone, and even the ever-present seabirds seemed to have vanished. An unsettling silence had fallen over the sea, broken only by the slap of waves against the Esperanza's hull. Something's not right, Matteo murmured to himself, a shiver running down his spine despite the warm sun overhead. Just then, a massive swell lifted the Esperanza, nearly knocking Matteo off his feet. He grabbed the side of the boat, his knuckles white as he steadied himself. Dios mío, he breathed, his heart racing. This wasn't normal. In all his years on the Patagonian Sea, he'd never experienced anything quite like this. As the boat settled, Matteo made a quick decision. He needed to pull in his nets and head back to shore. Whatever was happening, he didn't want to be caught out here if things got worse. He began the laborious process of hauling in the nets, his muscles screaming in protest. The choppy waters made the task even more difficult, the boat pitching and rolling with each wave. Suddenly, a sound cut through the air, a loud, forceful exhalation like a gust of wind through a narrow passage. Matteo's head snapped up, his eyes widening as he saw a plume of mist rise from the water about 50 meters from the boat. No puede ser, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind and waves. It can't be. But as the massive black and white form broke the surface, there was no denying what he was seeing. An orca, its distinctive dorsal fin slicing through the water as it moved with incredible grace and power. Matteo had seen orcas before, of course. They weren't uncommon in these waters, but never this close and never when he was alone in his small boat. For a moment he stood transfixed, watching as the magnificent creature swam in a lazy circle around his boat. Despite his initial fear, Matteo couldn't help but admire its beauty and power. Incredible, he breathed, a smile tugging at his lips, despite the danger. But then he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The orca wasn't alone. 2 more dorsal fins broke the surface, then another and another. A whole pod surrounding his tiny boat. Matteo's awe quickly turned to fear as he realized the precariousness of his situation. He was alone in a small boat, surrounded by some of the ocean's most intelligent and powerful predators. With shaking hands, he reached for the radio. Mayday, Mayday, he called, his voice trembling. This is the fishing boat Esperanza. I'm approximately 20 kilometers northeast of Puerto Deseado. I'm surrounded by a pod of orcas, requesting immediate assistance. Static crackled over the radio, and Matteo's heart sank. Had anyone heard him? Would help come in time if things took a turn for the worse? As if sensing his distress, the orcas began to swim faster, circling the Esperanza with increasing speed. The water churned around the boat, rocking it violently. Matteo stumbled, nearly falling overboard. He caught himself at the last moment, his heart pounding in his chest. As he regained his balance, his eyes locked with one of the orcas. Its intelligent gaze seemed to pierce right through him, assessing, calculating. In that moment, Matteo realized that this was no chance encounter. The orcas were hunting, and his boat, and possibly Matteo himself, had become their prey. As the sun began its descent towards the western horizon, Matteo Alvarez found himself trapped in a nightmare he never could have imagined when he set out that morning. Surrounded by the churning sea and circling predators, he could only hope that help would arrive before it was too late. The day that had started with such ordinary routines had become a fight for survival, and Matteo knew that his years of experience on these waters were about to be put to the ultimate test. The afternoon sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the churning waters of the Patagonian Sea. Matteo Alvarez, his weathered hands gripping the sides of his small fishing boat, the Esperanza, scanned the surrounding waters with growing unease. The pod of orcas that had encircled him earlier seemed to have disappeared, but the eerie silence that had fallen over the sea did little to calm his nerves. Come on, Matteo muttered, his eyes fixed on the radio. He had been trying to reach the Coast Guard for the past hour, but only static answered his calls. The isolation of his situation weighed heavily upon him. Deciding to make the most of this apparent reprieve, Matteo turned his attention back to his nets. The day's catch had been meager so far, and he couldn't afford to return to port empty-handed, orcas or no orcas. With a grunt of effort, he began to haul in the heavy nets. Madre de Dios, he breathed as the first fish came into view. Despite the terror of the past hour, a smile crept across his face. The net was teeming with fish, hake, mackerel, and even a few prized corvina. Elena mi amor, he said to himself, thinking of his daughter. Looks like you'll get those braces after all. As Matteo worked to bring in his unexpected bounty, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision made him pause. He turned, squinting against the glare of the setting sun on the water. There, about 50 meters out, a large, dark shape glided beneath the surface. Matteo's breath caught in his throat. No, 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 he whispered, his earlier elation evaporating instantly. Not now, not when I'm so close. The shape drew nearer, its movements smooth and purposeful. Matteo's hands trembled as he worked faster, desperate to secure his catch before the orca reached him. The net felt impossibly heavy, each pull sending jolts of pain through his already aching muscles. Suddenly, the Esperanza shuddered violently, nearly knocking Matteo off his feet. A dull thud reverberated through the hull, followed by the sound of scraping. The orca had struck the boat. Dios mío, Matteo gasped, his heart pounding. He scrambled to the side of the boat, peering over the edge. The water churned, dark shapes moving just beneath the surface. Not one orca, he realized with growing horror, but several. The pod had returned. Another impact rocked the boat, stronger, this time. Water sloshed over the sides, soaking Matteo's boots. He stumbled back, his mind racing. The orca's behavior was unlike anything he had ever encountered or heard of before. These weren't curious investigations. They were deliberate attacks. Matteo lunged for the radio once more. Mayday, mayday, he shouted into the receiver. This is the fishing boat Esperanza. I'm under attack by orcas, approximately 15 kilometers northeast of Puerto Deseado. Please, anyone, respond. The radio crackled, and a faint voice broke through the static. Zanza, this is Puerto de. Guard, what is your sight? Gracias a Dios, Matteo breathed. I'm under attack. Orcas are ramming my boat. I need immediate assistance. Stand by. Sending. Keep calm. The transmission cut out, leaving Matteo alone once more with the sounds of splashing water and the groaning of his beleaguered boat. A massive form breached the surface mere meters from the Esperanza. Matteo found himself face to face with one of the orcas, its black and white body glistening in the fading sunlight. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as man and beast regarded each other. The orca's eye, intelligent and somehow ancient, locked onto Matteo's. In that instant, he felt stripped bare, as if the creature was peering into his very soul. The moment shattered as the orca crashed back into the sea, sending a wave of water over the boat. Matteo was thrown backwards, his head striking the side of the cabin with a sickening crack. Stars exploded across his vision and he tasted blood in his mouth. Dazed, Matteo struggled to his feet, the world spinning around him. He blinked hard, trying to clear his vision. As his eyes refocused, he noticed something that turned his blood to ice. The orcas weren't attacking randomly. Their assaults were focused, concentrated on one area, the part of the boat where his net full of fish was secured. They're after the fish, he murmured, the realization dawning on him. These weren't mindless attacks. This was a calculated attempt to get at his catch. Another impact rocked the boat, and Matteo heard the ominous sound of splintering wood. Water began to trickle in through a newly formed crack in the hull. The situation was becoming dire. If he didn't act soon, the Esperanza would sink, leaving him at the mercy of both the orcas and the cold Patagonian waters. Matteo's mind raced. He knew orcas were intelligent, capable of complex hunting strategies. But this level of coordination, this deliberate targeting of a fishing boat, was unprecedented. He found himself caught between terror and awe at the creature's ingenuity. A particularly violent collision sent Matteo sprawling across the deck. As he pushed himself up, his hand fell upon his filleting knife. He stared at it, a desperate plan forming in his mind. "I'm sorry, Elena," he whispered, thinking of the braces his daughter needed, of his son's university fees. "Lo siento, Juan." Papa tried. With shaking hands, Mateo began to saw at the rope securing the net to his boat. The orcas continued their assault, each impact threatening to be the one that sent the Esperanza to the bottom. Water sloshed around Mateo's ankles as he worked, the boat taking on more water with each passing second. Come on," he urged himself, the rope fibers slowly giving way under his blade. His arms burned with the effort, every movement sending waves of pain through his battered body. With a final desperate slash, the rope parted. The net, heavy with fish, began to slip over the side of the boat. For a moment, Mateo was tempted to try and save at least part of his catch, but another bone-jarring impact from the orcas quickly disabused him of that notion. The net slid into the water with a splash, immediately sinking beneath the waves. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the attacks ceased. The orcas dove, their massive bodies easily visible in the clear water, as they pursued the sinking net. Mateo collapsed to the deck, his chest heaving as he gulped in air. The sudden silence was almost as overwhelming as the chaos that had preceded it. He lay there, feeling the gentle rocking of his wounded boat, scarcely able to believe he was still alive. A burst of static from the radio jolted him back to reality. "Esperanza, this is the Puerto Deseado Coast Guard. We are en route to your position. Please respond." Mateo dragged himself to the radio, every movement an effort. "This is the Esperanza," he managed, his voice hoarse. "The orcas, they're gone. They took my catch, my boat. It's taking on water." "Understood, Esperanza. Hold your position. We'll be there in approximately 20 minutes. Can you stay afloat that long?" Mateo looked around his battered vessel. The Esperanza had seen better days, but she was tough. Like him. "Si," he replied, a hint of his old determination creeping back into his voice. "We'll be here. Just hurry." As Mateo set about trying to patch the worst of the leaks, he found, his gaze continually drawn to the water. The orcas had vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving no trace of their presence save for the damage to his boat. In the gathering dusk, the sea looked peaceful, almost serene, but Mateo knew better now. He had glimpsed something today, something few had ever seen. The calculated intelligence, the raw power, and the uncompromising will of one of nature's most fearsome predators. The encounter had cost him his catch and nearly his life, but as Mateo watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, he felt a strange sense of privilege. He had looked into the eye of an orca and lived to tell the tale. It was an experience he knew would haunt him for years to come, both in his nightmares and in his moments of awe. In the distance, Mateo heard the faint thrum of an engine. The Coast Guard was coming. He had survived. But as he turned his battered boat towards the approaching lights, Mateo Alvarez knew that his relationship with the sea had been irrevocably changed. The Patagonian waters, once a source of livelihood and joy, now held a new terror and a new respect. The night fell fully as Mateo waited for rescue, the stars reflected in the now calm sea. Somewhere out there, a pod of orcas swam with full bellies, their prize won through cunning and strength. And despite everything, Mateo found himself hoping that he might one day encounter them again. From the safety of a much larger boat, the Coast Guard vessel cut through the choppy waters of the Patagonian Sea, its powerful searchlight illuminating the battered form of the Esperanza. Mateo Alvarez stood on the deck of his fishing boat, one hand gripping the railing to steady himself, the other waving weakly at his rescuers. "Senor Alvarez," a voice boomed over a loudspeaker. "Are you injured?" Mateo shook his head, then realized they probably couldn't see the gesture in the darkness. "No," he shouted back. "I'm okay." As the Coast Guard boat drew alongside, Mateo could make out the concerned faces of the crew. A stocky man in a crisp uniform stepped forward. "I'm Captain Ramirez," he said, extending a hand to help Mateo aboard. "Let's get you out of there before that boat of yours decides to become a submarine." Mateo managed a weak chuckle as he grasped the captain's hand. His legs felt unsteady as he stepped onto the larger vessel, the events of the day catching up with him all at once. Gracias, he mumbled, suddenly feeling every one of his 40 years and then some. Captain Ramirez guided him to a seat. You're lucky to be alive, senor. In all my years patrolling these waters, I've never heard of orcas attacking a boat like that. Mateo nodded grimly. Neither had I, and I hope I never see it again. As the Coast Guard crew began the process of securing and towing the Esperanza, a young officer approached with a thermos. Here, she said, pouring a cup of steaming liquid. You look like you could use this. Mateo accepted the cup gratefully, the warmth seeping into his cold hands. He took a sip, the rich taste of strong coffee spreading across his tongue. Thank you, he said, his voice steadier now. I'm Officer Gabriela Mendoza, the young woman introduced herself. I need to ask you a few questions about what happened, if you're up for it. Mateo nodded, and for the next half hour he recounted the harrowing events of the day. Officer Mendoza listened intently, her pen scratching across her notepad as she recorded every detail. And you're certain the orcas were specifically targeting your catch? She asked, her brow furrowed. Absolutely, Mateo replied. Once I cut the net loose, they went after it and left me alone. Captain Ramirez, who had been listening nearby, shook his head in disbelief. It's unprecedented. We'll need to alert the local fishing community and perhaps bring in some marine biologists to investigate. As they neared the harbor, Mateo's thoughts turned to his family. Is there a phone I could use? He asked. My wife and children, they'll be worried sick. Officer Mendoza nodded, producing a satellite phone from her pocket. Mateo dialed with shaking fingers, his heart pounding as he waited for an answer. Hola? Came the anxious voice of his wife, Maria. Maria, mi amor, Mateo said, his voice cracking. It's me. I'm okay. The flood of relief and worry in his wife's voice brought tears to his eyes. He reassured her as best he could, promising to explain everything when he got home. As they entered the harbor, Mateo could see a small crowd gathered on the docks. Word of the incident had spread quickly in the tight-knit fishing community. He spotted Carlos, his friend from that morning, standing at the forefront, his face etched with concern. The Coast Guard vessel docked smoothly and Mateo disembarked on unsteady legs. Carlos rushed forward, enveloping him in a bear hug. Madre de Dios, Mateo, Carlos exclaimed, his voice thick with emotion. When we heard, I thought. Mateo patted his friend's back. It's okay, amigo, I'm still here. As the small crowd of friends and fellow fishermen surrounded him, offering words of support and relief, Mateo felt a complex mix of emotions wash over him. Gratitude for his survival warred with a deep-seated fear that he couldn't quite shake. Captain Ramirez approached, cutting through the crowd. Senor Alvarez, he said, his tone serious, I'm afraid we're not quite done. We need you to come to the station to make an official statement. Mateo nodded wearily. Of course, whatever you need. As they made their way to the Coast Guard station, the adrenaline that had been sustaining Mateo began to ebb. The full weight of the day's events settled on his shoulders, and he found himself reliving the terrifying moments of the attack. The Coast Guard station was a flurry of activity when they arrived. News of the unprecedented ORCA attack had apparently reached far beyond the local community. Mateo spotted several unfamiliar faces, some clutching cameras and notepads. Reporters, Captain Ramirez muttered, noticing Mateo's questioning look. News travels fast. Don't worry, you don't have to talk to them if you don't want to. Mateo nodded gratefully as they made their way inside. He was led to a small, brightly lit room where a stern-looking woman in a crisp uniform waited. Senor Alvarez, she said, extending her hand. I'm Commander Lucia Vega. I understand you've had quite an ordeal. For the next 2 hours, Mateo recounted his experience in painstaking detail. Commander Vega listened intently, occasionally interjecting with questions that forced Mateo to recall moments he'd rather forget. And you're certain the orcas were deliberately targeting your catch? She asked, echoing Officer Mendoza's earlier question. Mateo nodded emphatically. Yes. Their attacks were focused on where the net was secured. Once I cut it loose, they left me alone. Commander Vega leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. It's extraordinary, she mused. We've had reports of orcas interacting with fishing boats before, but nothing like this. It's almost as if they've learned to associate the boats with an easy meal. A chill ran down Mateo's spine at her words. The memory of the orca's intelligent gaze meeting his own flashed through his mind. There had been something in that look, something that went beyond mere animal instinct. As the interview wound down, Commander Vega's expression softened slightly. "Thank you for your cooperation, Senor Alvarez. Your account will be crucial in helping us understand and prevent incidents like this in the future." Mateo nodded wearily. "I just hope no one else has to go through what I did today." As he left the station, Mateo was surprised to find Carlos waiting for him. "I thought you could use a ride home," his friend said with a small smile. Mateo felt a rush of gratitude. "Gracias, amigo." The drive to Mateo's small house on the outskirts of town was quiet, both men lost in their thoughts. As they pulled up, Mateo saw the front door fly open, his wife and children spilling out. "Papa!" cried Elena, his 12-year-old daughter, as she flung herself into his arms. Juan, his 18-year-old son, was right behind her, his usual teenage stoicism, cracking as he embraced his father. Maria approached last, tears streaming down her face as she cupped Mateo's cheeks in her hands. "Mi amor," she whispered. "I was so afraid." As Mateo held his family close, the emotions he'd been holding at bay finally broke through. He wept, the terror and relief of the day pouring out of him. Later that night, after the children had finally been convinced to go to bed, Mateo sat at the kitchen table with Maria, a cup of strong coffee warming his hands. "What will you do now?" Maria asked softly, her hand covering his. Mateo stared into his cup, watching the dark liquid swirl. The question had been haunting him since he'd set foot on dry land. The sea had been his life for so long. Could he really walk away? "I don't know," he admitted. "The Esperanza is damaged. It'll take weeks to repair, maybe months. And even then..." He trailed off, the memory of the orca's intelligent eye flashing through his mind once more. Maria squeezed his hand. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. We'll figure it out together." Mateo managed a small smile, lifting her hand to his lips. "What would I do without you?" As they sat in comfortable silence, Mateo's mind drifted back to the events of the day. The terror was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But there was something else too. A sense of wonder at the intelligence and adaptability of the orcas. They had outsmarted him, a seasoned fisherman with decades of experience. In that moment, Mateo realized that his relationship with the sea had fundamentally changed. The Patagonian waters, once a source of livelihood and joy, now held a new kind of respect and a new kind of fear. As he finally crawled into bed that night, exhaustion overtaking him, Mateo knew that whatever path he chose moving forward, he would never forget the day he looked into the eye of an orca and saw not just a predator, but an intelligent being capable of outwitting even the wiliest of humans. The Patagonian Sea had shown him its true face, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. And Mateo Alvarez, like countless sailors and fishermen before him, had been humbled by its awesome power. The following days passed in a blur for Mateo Alvarez. His encounter with the orcas had made him something of a local celebrity in Puerto Deseado. Reporters clamored for interviews. Marine biologists sought his first-hand account, and fellow fishermen peppered him with questions. But beneath the veneer of excitement, a deep unease had taken root in Mateo's heart. A week after the incident, Mateo found himself standing on the dock, staring out at the horizon. The Esperanza bobbed gently nearby, her hull still bearing the scars of the ORCA attack. He had been avoiding this moment, but he knew he couldn't put it off any longer. It was time to face his fears. "I thought I'd find you here," a familiar voice said behind him. Mateo turned to see Carlos approaching, a thermos in hand. "Seems like old times, no?" Carlos said with a wry smile, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "Except usually you're the one heading out and I'm the one waving goodbye." Mateo accepted the cup gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. "Gracias, amigo. I needed to see her." Carlos nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And? What's the verdict?" Mateo sighed, his gaze returning to the Esperanza. "The repairs are almost done. She'll be ready to sail in a day or 2. That's not what I meant, Carlos said gently. Are you ready, Mateo? The question hung in the air between them, heavy, with implications. Mateo took a long sip of coffee, buying time as he wrestled with his thoughts. I don't know, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. The way they moved, the intelligence in their eyes. It wasn't just an animal attack, Carlos. They knew exactly what they were doing. Carlos laid a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. No one would blame you if you decided to stay on land, you know. There are other jobs. What else would I do? Mateo interrupted, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. The sea is all I know. It's how I've supported my family for 20 years. Elena needs her braces. Juan is starting university soon. I can't just walk away. You almost died, Mateo, Carlos reminded him gently. Surely your family would rather have you alive than... Than what? Mateo snapped, immediately regretting his tone. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging within him. I'm sorry, amigo, I need to do this. I need to know if I still can. Carlos nodded, understanding etched on his weathered face. Then let me come with you. Just for the first trip. You shouldn't be alone out there, not after what happened. Mateo started to protest, but the words died on his lips as he saw the determination in his friend's eyes. After a moment, he nodded. Okay. Thank you, Carlos. The next morning dawned, clear and calm, a perfect day for fishing. Mateo arrived at the dock early, his stomach churning with a mix of anticipation and dread. He found Carlos already there, loading supplies onto the Esperanza. Ready? Carlos asked as Mateo approached. Mateo nodded, trying to project a confidence he didn't quite feel. As I'll ever be. As they cast off, Mateo felt a familiar thrill coursing through him. Despite everything, there was still a part of him that loved this. The open water, the salt spray on his face, the promise of adventure that each trip held. They sailed in companionable silence for a while, the coastline of Patagonia slowly receding behind them. As they neared Mateo's usual fishing grounds, however, he felt his anxiety begin to spike. Maybe we should try somewhere else, he said, his eyes scanning the horizon nervously. Somewhere closer to shore. Carlos shook his head. The fish are here, Mateo. You know that better than anyone. We can't let fear dictate where we fish. Mateo knew his friend was right, but it did little to calm his nerves. With shaking hands, he began to prepare the nets. The morning passed, uneventfully, their nets gradually filling with a respectable catch. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Mateo felt some of his tension begin to ease. Perhaps it had been a freak occurrence, he thought. Perhaps lightning wouldn't strike twice. It was just past noon when Carlos spotted the first dorsal fin slicing through the water. Mateo, he called, his voice taut with alarm. Look! Mateo's head snapped up, his heart leaping into his throat. There, about 100 meters from the boat, was an unmistakable black fin cutting through the waves. No, Mateo whispered, his earlier calm evaporating instantly. No, no, no. Calm down, Carlos said, though Mateo could hear the strain in his voice. It's just one. Maybe it's just curious. But even as the words left Carlos's mouth, more fins appeared. 2, then 3, then a half dozen. The orcas moved with purpose, quickly closing the distance to the Esperanza. Mateo felt panic rising in his chest, threatening to overwhelm him. His hands shook as he reached for the radio. Mayday, Mayday, he called, his voice cracking. This is the fishing boat Esperanza. We're under attack by orcas again, approximately 20 kilometers northeast of Puerto Deseado. The radio crackled with static. Then a voice responded. Esperanza, this is Puerto Deseado Coast Guard. Can you confirm your position? As Carlos relayed their coordinates, Mateo watched in horror as the first orca slammed into the side of the boat. The impact sent tremors through the Esperanza, nearly knocking both men off their feet. They're after the fish again, Mateo realized, his earlier encounter flashing through his mind. We need to cut the nets loose. Carlos looked at him in disbelief. But the catch... Another powerful hit rocked the boat, cutting off Carlos's protest. Water sloshed over the sides, soaking their boots. The catch isn't worth our lives, Mateo said grimly, already moving towards the nets. Together they worked frantically to release the heavy nets. The orcas continued their assault, each impact threatening to capsize the small boat. Mateo's hands bled as he sawed at the tough ropes, desperation lending him strength. Just as they managed to cut the last rope, a particularly vicious hit sent Carlos stumbling. Mateo watched in horror as his friend lost his balance, teetering on the edge of the boat. "Carlos!" Mateo shouted, lunging forward. His fingers grasped the fabric of Carlos's jacket, but it wasn't enough. With a cry of terror, Carlos toppled over the side and into the churning waters. Without hesitation, Mateo dove in after him. The cold of the Patagonian sea hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. He surfaced, gasping, his eyes frantically searching for Carlos. "Carlos!" he shouted again, fighting against the waves. "Where are you?" A splash to his left caught his attention. Carlos surfaced, coughing and sputtering. Mateo swam towards him, his heart pounding, with fear, not just of drowning, but of the massive predators that surrounded them. As Mateo reached Carlos, he felt something brush against his leg. He looked down, his blood turning to ice as he saw a massive black and white form glide beneath them. "The boat!" Carlos gasped, pointing. "We need to get back to the boat." Mateo nodded, too breathless to speak. Supporting Carlos, he began to swim towards the Esperanza, which had drifted several meters away. The journey back to the boat felt like an eternity. Every second, Mateo expected to feel the jaws of an orca closing around him. But remarkably, the massive creatures seemed to ignore them, focused instead on the sinking net full of fish. Finally, they reached the Esperanza. With the last of his strength, Mateo helped Carlos climb aboard before hauling himself up. They collapsed on the deck, chests heaving as they gulped in air. For several long moments, neither man spoke. The sounds of splashing gradually faded as the orcas finished with their prize and moved away. "You saved my life," Carlos finally said, his voice hoarse. Mateo shook his head. "You came out here because of me. I put you in danger." "We're alive," Carlos replied firmly. "That's what matters." As if on cue, the distant sound of an engine reached their ears. The Coast Guard ship appeared on the horizon, racing towards them. As help approached, Mateo found himself staring out at the now calm sea. The orcas were gone, leaving no trace of their presence save for the missing nets and the terror that still coursed through his veins. In that moment, Mateo Alvarez knew that his life had changed irrevocably. He had faced his fear and survived, but at what cost? The sea, once his livelihood and passion, had become a source of terror and uncertainty. As the Coast Guard ship drew alongside, Mateo helped Carlos to his feet. They would survive this day, but the true test was yet to come. Could he ever find the courage to venture out onto these waters again? Or was this the end of the only life he had ever known? The questions swirled in Mateo's mind as he prepared to board the rescue vessel. Whatever the future held, he knew one thing for certain. The Patagonian Sea would never look the same to him again. The Coast Guard vessel cut through the choppy waters, its powerful engines humming as it carried Mateo and Carlos back to Puerto Deseado. The two men sat huddled under thick blankets, their clothes still damp from their unplanned swim. Mateo stared blankly at the horizon, his mind replaying the terrifying events of the day. "Señor Alvarez." A voice broke through his reverie. He looked up to see Captain Ramirez approaching, concern etched on his weathered face. "How are you holding up?" Mateo managed a weak smile. "I've been better, Captain. But we're alive, thanks." "To you and your team." Captain Ramirez nodded solemnly. "I've been patrolling these waters for over 2 decades, and I've never seen anything like this. 2 attacks in such a short span of time. It's unprecedented." Carlos, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "What does it mean, Captain?" "For us fishermen, I mean." The captain's expression grew grave. "I'm afraid that's not for me to decide. The maritime authorities will be convening an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. Until then, I'd strongly advise against any fishing expeditions in that area." Mateo felt a cold dread settling in his stomach. This was more than just a personal crisis now. It threatened the livelihood of the entire fishing community in Puerto Deseado. As they neared the harbor, Mateo could see a crowd gathering on the docks. Word of the second attack had spread quickly. He spotted Maria and the children at the forefront, their faces etched with worry. The moment the boat docked, Maria rushed forward, enveloping Mateo in a fierce embrace. "Mi amor," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I thought I'd lost you." Mateo held her tightly, breathing in her familiar scent. "I'm here, querida. I'm safe." Elena and Juan joined the embrace, and for a moment, the family stood locked together, oblivious to the commotion around them. The next few days passed in a blur of interviews, medical checkups, and tense discussions. The local fishing community was in an uproar, torn between fear for their safety and concern for their livelihoods. A week after the second attack, Mateo found himself sitting in a crowded town hall. The air was thick with tension as fishermen, local officials, and marine biologists gathered to discuss the crisis. Dr. Lucia Vega, a renowned marine biologist, stood at the podium, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "What we're seeing here is a significant shift in orca behavior," she explained. "These animals are demonstrating a level of problem-solving and coordination that's quite remarkable, albeit deeply concerning for our fishing industry." A gruff voice called out from the back of the room. "Remarkable? They're destroying our livelihoods. What are we supposed to do, just sit back and watch our families starve?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Dr. Vega held up her hands, calling for calm. "I understand your frustration, but we need to approach this scientifically. Rash actions could have severe ecological consequences." Mayor Rodriguez stepped forward, his face grim. "We've been in contact with the national government. They're considering declaring this an economic emergency, which would open up relief funds for affected fishermen." A mix of relief and skepticism greeted this announcement. Mateo listened silently, his mind racing. Relief funds might help in the short term, but what about the future? Fishing wasn't just a job for most of the people in this room. It was a way of life. As the meeting dragged on, proposals were debated and discarded. Some suggested using acoustic deterrents to keep the orcas away from fishing boats. Others argued for expanding their fishing grounds, even if it meant longer and more dangerous journeys. Finally, unable to contain himself any longer, Mateo stood up. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to him. "We're missing the point," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "These orcas, they're not just animals acting on instinct. They're intelligent. They're learning. We need to find a way to coexist with them, not fight against them." Dr. Vega nodded approvingly. "Senor Alvarez is right. We need to adapt our fishing practices. Perhaps we could explore alternative methods that don't involve leaving nets in the water for extended periods." The discussion that followed was heated but productive. By the end of the meeting, a tentative plan had been formed. A task force would be created combining the expertise of local fishermen, marine biologists, and technology experts to develop new, orca-resistant fishing methods. As the crowd dispersed, Mateo felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Carlos, a glimmer of hope in his friend's eyes. "You did good in there, amigo," Carlos said. "You gave us a way forward." Mateo managed a small smile. "We'll see. It's not going to be easy." Over the next few weeks, Mateo threw himself into the work of the task force. He spent long hours poring over research papers, discussing ideas with scientists, and testing prototypes. The work was challenging, often frustrating, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he'd been missing. One evening, as Mateo sat at the kitchen table surrounded by diagrams and notes, Maria approached with a cup of coffee. "How's it going, mi amor?" she asked, setting the cup down beside him. Mateo sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Slowly, but we're making progress. We've been looking at this new type of net that can be quickly retracted if orcas are detected nearby. And there's talk of using underwater drones to monitor orca activity in real time." Maria sat down beside him, taking his hand in hers. "I'm proud of you, Mateo. You could have given up after what happened, but instead you're fighting to find a solution." Mateo squeezed her hand, grateful for her unwavering support. "I couldn't just walk away. This isn't just about me. It's about our whole community." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the shore. Finally, Maria spoke again, her voice soft but determined. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You know that, right? Matteo nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. I know, querida. I couldn't do this without you. As the weeks turned into months, the situation in Puerto Deseado gradually began to stabilize. The new fishing methods developed by the task force, while not perfect, had significantly reduced orca encounters. Slowly but surely, boats began to venture out into the deeper waters again. On a crisp autumn morning, Matteo stood on the deck of the Esperanza, surveying the familiar expanse of the Patagonian Sea. The boat had been retrofitted with the latest orca deterrent technology, its hull reinforced to withstand potential impacts. Carlos appeared beside him, checking the new sonar equipment. Ready for this, amigo? Matteo took a deep breath, feeling the salt air fill his lungs. The fear was still there, a constant presence in the back of his mind. But alongside it was something else, a determination to reclaim his place on these waters. Ready, he replied, his voice firm. As they cast off, Matteo felt a complex mix of emotions wash over him. The past few months had been a journey of fear, resilience, and adaptation. He had faced his deepest fears and emerged changed, but unbroken. The Esperanza moved steadily out to sea, its new equipment humming softly. Matteo kept a watchful eye on the horizon, knowing that the orcas were out there somewhere. But for the first time since the attacks, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. They had found a way to coexist with these intelligent predators, to continue their way of life, while respecting the orca's place in the ecosystem. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. As the coastline of Puerto Deseado faded into the distance, Matteo allowed himself a small smile. The Patagonian Sea had challenged him, nearly broken him, but in the end, it had also made him stronger. Whatever the future held, he was ready to face it one wave at a time. The Esperanza cut through the choppy waters of the Patagonian Sea, its newly reinforced hull creaking softly against the waves. Matteo Alvarez stood at the helm, his weathered hands gripping the wheel with practiced ease. Beside him, Carlos monitored the array of new equipment that now crowded the small cabin. Anything on the sonar? Matteo asked, his eyes scanning the horizon. Carlos shook his head. All clear so far, but you know how quickly that can change. Matteo nodded grimly. The past few months had taught them all to be perpetually vigilant. The orcas had become more than just marine predators. They were now an ever-present threat, lurking beneath the surface of every fishing expedition. As they neared their usual fishing grounds, Matteo felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Despite the new safety measures, the memory of their previous encounters remained vivid in his mind. Let's start deploying the nets, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Remember, at the first sign of any large marine life, we retract immediately. Carlos nodded, moving to the stern to begin the process. The new nets were a marvel of engineering, lightweight yet strong, designed to be quickly retracted at a moment's notice. As they unfurled into the dark waters, Matteo allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. Perhaps today would be different. For several hours they worked in companionable silence, the rhythmic sound of the waves and the gentle hum of machinery their only accompaniment. The nets were yielding a decent catch, not as bountiful as in the pre-orca days, but enough to make the trip worthwhile. It was just past noon when the first alarm sounded. Carlos's head snapped up from the monitoring station. Matteo, large marine life detected, approaching fast from the southeast. Matteo's heart began to race. How many? At least 3. No, 4 signatures. They're big, Matteo. Has to be orcas. Sweat beaded on Matteo's forehead as he quickly assessed their options. Start retracting the nets, now. As Carlos rushed to initiate the retraction sequence, Matteo gunned the engine, turning the Esperanza towards open water. The boat lurched forward, fighting against the drag of the partially deployed nets. Come on, Matteo muttered, willing the nets to retract faster. A loud splash off the port side made both men flinch. Matteo turned just in time to see a massive black and white form breach the surface, water cascading off its sleek body as it crashed back into the sea, mere meters from the boat. Dios mío, Carlos whispered, his face pale. The orca's appearance seemed to galvanize the men into action. Carlos worked feverishly at the controls, coaxing every ounce of speed from the retraction mechanism. Matteo, meanwhile, focused on keeping the boat steady, acutely aware of the vulnerable position they were in. Another alarm blared from the console. "They're surrounding us!" Carlos shouted, his voice tight with fear. Matteo could see them now, sleek dorsal fins slicing through the water on all sides of the Esperanza. The orcas moved with a coordinated precision that sent chills down his spine. This was no random encounter. It was a calculated hunt. Suddenly, the boat shuddered violently. Matteo stumbled, nearly losing his grip on the wheel. What was that? Carlos frantically scanned the readouts. They're attacking the nets. The strain. It's too much. We're going to lose them. Matteo made a split-second decision. Cut them loose. All of them. Now. But the catch. Do it! Matteo roared, fighting to keep the boat under control as another impact rocked them. With shaking hands, Carlos initiated the emergency release. There was a series of loud snaps as the cables holding the nets in place were severed. The Esperanza lurched forward, suddenly free of the weight that had been holding it back. Matteo wasted no time. He pushed the throttle to its maximum, steering the boat away from the feeding frenzy that was now taking place where their nets had been. For several tense minutes they raced across the waves, neither man daring to speak. Matteo's eyes darted constantly between the path ahead and the sonar display, watching for any sign that the orcas were pursuing them. Finally, Carlos broke the silence. I think we're clear. They're not following. Matteo let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he eased back on the throttle. The adrenaline that had been coursing through his veins began to subside, leaving him feeling drained and oddly hollow. We lost everything, he said quietly, the reality of their situation sinking in. The nets, the catch, all of it. Carlos placed a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. We're alive, amigo, that's what matters. Matteo nodded, trying to take solace in that fact. But as he turned the Esperanza back towards Puerto Deseado, a heavy weight settled in his chest. They had escaped, yes, but at what cost? The journey back to port was somber. Both men were lost in their thoughts, grappling with the implications of what had just occurred. All their preparations, all the new technology, in the end, it had barely made a difference. As the coastline of Puerto Deseado came into view, Matteo finally broke the silence. We can't go on like this, Carlos. His friend looked at him, a question in his eyes. This cat and mouse game with the orcas. We're fighting a losing battle. They're too smart, too adaptable. We need to find another way. Carlos sighed heavily. What other way is there, Matteo? Fishing is all we know. It's our livelihood, our heritage. Matteo shook his head, a determination settling over him. I don't know yet, but there has to be something. We can't just give up, but we can't keep risking our lives like this either. As they docked, Matteo could see a small crowd gathering. News of their hasty return had clearly spread quickly. He spotted Maria among the onlookers, her face etched with worry. The moment his feet touched the dock, Maria was there, enveloping him in a fierce embrace. Mi amor, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. When we heard, I was so afraid. Matteo held her tightly, drawing strength from her presence. I'm okay, querida, we both are. As they pulled apart, Matteo saw Dr. Vega approaching, her brow furrowed with concern. Senor Alvarez, I heard what happened. Are you all right? Matteo nodded wearily. We're fine, doctor. But we lost everything. The nets, the catch, all of it. Dr. Vega's expression grew grave. This is serious. The orcas seem to be adapting to our countermeasures faster than we can develop them. We need to rethink our entire approach. I agree, Matteo said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. In fact, I have an idea I'd like to discuss with you. Over the next few hours, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Matteo found himself in an intense discussion with Dr. Vega, Carlos, and several other key members of the fishing community. What if, Matteo proposed, his eyes alight with a new sense of purpose? Instead of trying to outsmart the orcas or scare them away, we try to work with them. The idea was met with skepticism at first. Work with them? They're predators, Matteo. They're not going to suddenly decide to leave our fish alone. one of the older fishermen scoffed. But Dr. Vega looked intrigued. Actually, there might be something to this. In some parts of the world, there are documented cases of dolphins cooperating with human fishermen. If orcas are as intelligent as we believe them to be, perhaps a similar arrangement could be possible. The discussion that followed was heated, but productive. Ideas were proposed, debated, and refined. By the time the meeting broke up in the early hours of the morning, a tentative plan had begun to take shape. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Matteo found himself at the center of a bold new initiative, working closely with marine biologists, behaviorists, and his fellow fishermen to develop a revolutionary approach to fishing in orca-populated waters. The plan was audacious. Instead of trying to keep the orcas away from their fishing grounds, they would attempt to create designated sharing zones. Using a combination of acoustic signals and carefully timed feeding, they would try to train the orcas to associate certain areas with easy meals, while leaving other areas for the fishermen. It was a long shot, and many in the community remained skeptical. But as the weeks passed and the first tentative trials began, something remarkable started to happen. The orcas, true to their reputation for intelligence, began to show signs of understanding the new system. There were setbacks, of course. More than once, Matteo found himself racing back to port, his heart pounding as a pod of orcas pursued his boat. But slowly, gradually, a new equilibrium began to establish itself. 6 months after that fateful day when Matteo and Carlos had barely escaped with their lives, the Esperanza once again set out to sea. But this time, things were different. Instead of nets full of fish, the hold was stocked with carefully portioned offerings for their new marine partners. As they approached the designated sharing zone, Matteo felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation. "Ready?" he asked Carlos, his hand hovering over the control for the acoustic signal. Carlos nodded, a nervous smile playing on his lips. "As I'll ever be." Matteo pressed the button, sending a series of clicks and whistles into the water, the dinner bell for their orca collaborators. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Matteo began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. Then suddenly, a familiar black fin broke the surface about 100 meters from the boat. "There!" Carlos exclaimed, pointing. More fins appeared, and soon the Esperanza was surrounded by a pod of orcas. But unlike their previous encounters, there was no aggression in their movements. They swam lazy circles around the boat, their intelligent eyes watching expectantly. With trembling hands, Matteo began to lower the first offering into the water, a net full of fish, designed to break open upon contact. The moment it hit the water, the orcas dove. There was a flurry of activity beneath the surface, and then they re-emerged, seeming almost playful in their movements. Matteo and Carlos watched in awe as the scene unfolded. It wasn't perfect. Some of the orcas still tried to approach the boat, perhaps hoping for more food. But overall, the animals seemed to understand and respect the new arrangement. As they made their way back to their own fishing grounds, unmolested by the orcas, Matteo felt a profound sense of accomplishment wash over him. They had done it. Against all odds, they had found a way to coexist with these magnificent, intelligent creatures. "You know," Carlos said as they began to deploy their nets in the orca-free zone, "I never thought I'd say this, but I think I'm starting to like those big black and white pescados." Matteo laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Don't get too attached, amigo. They're still wild animals after all." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Matteo stood at the helm of the Esperanza, surveying the peaceful waters around them. The fear that had been his constant companion for so long had been replaced by something else, a deep respect for the ocean and all its inhabitants, and a renewed sense of his place within this complex ecosystem. The Patagonian Sea had challenged him, nearly broken him, but in the end, it had also taught him one of the most valuable lessons of his life, that sometimes the key to survival isn't about fighting against nature, but learning to work in harmony with it. As the first stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Matteo turned the Esperanza towards home, carrying with him not just a hold full of fish, but a newfound hope for the future. a future where man and orca could share the bounty of the sea, each respecting the other's place in the grand tapestry of life. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the docks of Puerto Deseado as Mateo Alvarez made his way towards the harbor master's office. The salty breeze carried with it the familiar sounds of a fishing town coming to life. The clanking of boat equipment, the calls of seagulls, and the low rumble of engines warming up for the day's work. Mateo's footsteps echoed on the weathered, wooden planks, his mind preoccupied with the task ahead. It had been 3 months since the implementation of the ORCA cooperation program, and today was the day they would present their findings to the local authorities and representatives from the national government. As he approached the office, he saw Dr. Lucia Vega waiting outside, her face etched with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "Buenos dias, Dr. Vega," Mateo called out, forcing a smile despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach. "Ah, Mateo, good morning," she replied, her eyes lighting up. "Are you ready for this?" Mateo took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be. There's a lot riding on this presentation." Dr. Vega nodded solemnly. "Indeed there is. But remember, what we've achieved here is nothing short of remarkable. We just need to make them see that." Before Mateo could respond, the door to the office swung open, revealing the gruff face of Harbor Master Rodriguez. "They're ready for you," he grunted, gesturing for them to enter. The small conference room was packed with an array of official-looking individuals. Mateo recognized Mayor Gonzalez and Chief of Police Morales, but the others, men and women in crisp suits with stern expressions, were unfamiliar to him. His palms began to sweat as he took his place at the front of the room beside Dr. Vega. Mayor Gonzalez cleared his throat, addressing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to discuss the unconventional and, frankly, controversial measures that have been implemented in response to our ORCA situation. Dr. Vega and Mr. Alvarez will present their findings, after which we'll open the floor for questions and discussion." Dr. Vega stepped forward, her professional demeanor masking any nervousness she might have felt. "Thank you, Mayor. As you're all aware, the increasing interactions between orcas and our fishing vessels posed a significant threat to both human safety and our local economy. Traditional deterrent methods proved ineffective, forcing us to think outside the box." She clicked a button, and a series of graphs appeared on the screen behind her. "Over the past 3 months, we've been testing a cooperative fishing model, where designated sharing zones are established for the orcas, while other areas are reserved exclusively for our fishermen." Mateo watched as Dr. Vega expertly walked the officials through the data. Incident reports, catch volumes, and orca population studies. He marveled at her ability to translate their experiences into the language of statistics and scientific analysis. "As you can see," she concluded, "not only have dangerous orca vessel interactions decreased by 87%, but our overall fish yield has stabilized, and in some areas, even increased." A murmur rippled through the room. Mateo could see a mix of skepticism and intrigue on the faces of the officials. One of the suited men, his silver hair neatly combed, leaned forward. "This is all very interesting, Dr. Vega, but it seems rather fanciful. Are we really to believe that these animals can be trained to cooperate with our fishing industry?" Dr. Vega opened her mouth to respond, but Mateo surprised himself by stepping forward. "If I may," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I'm not a scientist, I'm a fisherman. I've spent my life on these waters, and I've seen firsthand what these orcas are capable of." He paused, making eye contact with each person in the room. 3 months ago, I was ready to give up the only life I've ever known. The orcas had become so aggressive, so targeted in their attacks, that going out to sea felt like a death sentence. But this program, it's changed everything. Mateo's voice grew more passionate as he spoke. "I've seen these animals learn, adapt. They're not just mindless predators. They're intelligent, capable of understanding complex systems. We're not training them like circus animals. We're communicating with them, establishing a mutual understanding." He gestured to the graphs behind him. "The numbers don't lie. But more than that, I can tell you that for the first time in years, I go out on my boat without fear. I see those dorsal fins break the surface, and instead of panic, I feel respect. We're sharing the sea, not fighting over it." The room fell silent as Mateo finished speaking. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, wondering if he had overstepped. After what felt like an eternity, the silver-haired official spoke again. "Mr. Alvarez, your passion is evident, but passion doesn't make policy. Dr. Vega, how sustainable is this program? What's to prevent the ORCAs from eventually rejecting this arrangement and returning to their previous behavior?" Dr. Vega stepped forward, a hint of a smile on her face. "An excellent question, Mr. Secretary. While we can never predict animal behavior with 100% certainty, our ongoing monitoring suggests that this cooperative model is actually reinforcing itself over time." She clicked to a new slide, showing a complex diagram of oceanic currents and fish migrations. By establishing these sharing zones, we're actually creating a more stable ecosystem. The orcas are acting as a natural control on certain fish populations, which in turn is leading to more sustainable overall fish stocks. It's a delicate balance, but one that benefits both the orcas and our fishing industry. The questioning continued for another hour, with Mateo and Dr. Vega tag-teaming their responses. They addressed concerns about long-term viability, potential, risks, and the costs associated with maintaining the program. As the meeting drew to a close, Mayor Gonzalez stood up. "Thank you, Dr. Vega, Mr. Alvarez. This has been illuminating. We'll need time to digest this information and discuss next steps. We'll be in touch with our decision." As the officials filed out of the room, Mateo felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. He turned to Dr. Vega, who was gathering her materials. "Do you think we convinced them?" She gave him a tired smile. "I think we gave them a lot to think about. Your speech was quite powerful, Mateo. I think it made a real impact." Mateo nodded, not entirely convinced. As they left the harbor master's office, he was surprised to see a small crowd had gathered outside. Word of the meeting had spread, and it seemed like half the town had turned up to hear the outcome. Carlos pushed his way to the front. "Well, how did it go?" Mateo shrugged, feeling the weight of all those expectant eyes. "We presented our findings, now we wait." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Mateo could sense the mix of hope and skepticism, the fear of change warring with the desire for a solution. An older fisherman, Pablo, spoke up. "And what if they say no? What if they shut down this loco scheme of yours? What then?" Before Mateo could respond, another voice cut through the crowd. "Then we fight for it." Mateo turned to see Maria making her way towards him, their children in tow. She reached him, taking his hand in hers. "This isn't just about fishing anymore. It's about our way of life, our relationship with the sea. If the officials can't see that, then we'll make them see." A chorus of agreement rose from the crowd. Mateo felt a swell of emotion in his chest, looking at the faces of his friends, neighbors, and family. Whatever came next, he realized, they would face it together. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Mateo tried to keep himself busy, making repairs to the Esperanza and helping Carlos with his boat, but his mind constantly returned to the meeting, replaying every question, every response, wondering if they had done enough. It was a week later when the call finally came. Mateo was at home, helping Elena with her homework, when his phone rang. He recognized the mayor's number immediately. "Senor Alvarez," Mayor Gonzalez's voice crackled through the speaker. "We've reached a decision. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? And bring Dr. Vega with you?" Mateo's heart raced as he agreed, hanging up the phone with a shaking hand. "Papa?" Elena's voice broke through his thoughts. "Is everything okay?" He turned to his daughter, forcing a smile. "Yes, mija. Everything's fine. Just some business with the mayor." That night, sleep eluded Mateo. He tossed and turned, his mind conjuring up every possible scenario for the morning's meeting. Maria, sensing his distress, curled up closer to him, her presence a comforting anchor. "Whatever happens," she whispered in the darkness, "we'll get through it together." Mateo squeezed her hand in silent gratitude. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect day that usually had Mateo itching to get out on the water. Today, however, his feet felt leaden as he made his way to the mayor's office, Dr. Vega at his side. Mayor Gonzalez greeted them with a neutral expression, gesturing for them to sit. "Thank you for coming," he began, his tone giving nothing away. As you know, we've been in intense discussions since your presentation. This decision wasn't made lightly. Matteo held his breath, feeling as though the fate of their entire community hung in the balance. The mayor continued. After careful consideration of the data, testimonies from local fishermen, and consultations with marine biology experts, we've decided. He paused, and Matteo felt as though his heart might burst from his chest. Officially endorse and expand the ORCA cooperation program. The words took a moment to sink in. Matteo blinked, looking at Dr. Vega to confirm he had heard correctly. The brilliant smile spreading across her face told him he had. Really? Matteo breathed, scarcely daring to believe it. Mayor Gonzalez nodded, a small smile finally breaking through his official demeanor. Really? Your results are impossible to ignore. Not only has this program increased safety and stabilized our fishing yields, but it's also positioned Puerto Deseado at the forefront of innovative marine conservation practices. He leaned forward, his expression growing serious. Make no mistake, there will be challenges ahead. We'll need to work closely with national agencies, expand our research efforts, and possibly even revise some fishing regulations. But we believe this is the right path forward. Dr. Vega was practically beaming. Thank you, Mayor. This is incredible news. I assure you we won't let you down. As they left the mayor's office, Matteo felt as though he was walking on air. The weight that had been pressing down on him for months, no years, had finally lifted. They had done it. They had found a way to coexist with the orcas, to continue their way of life while respecting the delicate balance of nature. Word spread quickly through the small town. By the time Matteo reached the docks, a crowd had already gathered. Ikyo saw faces filled with hope, with excitement, and yes, still some with skepticism. But overwhelmingly, there was a sense of pride. Pride in their community for facing this challenge head-on and finding an innovative solution. Carlos pushed his way through the crowd, enveloping Matteo in a bear hug. You did it, amigo. You really did it, Matteo returned the embrace, laughing. We did it, Carlos, all of us. As the excitement died down and people began to disperse, Matteo found himself standing alone at the edge of the dock, looking out over the vast expanse of the Patagonian Sea. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and in the distance he saw a familiar black fin break the surface. A sense of profound peace washed over him. For the first time in years, he looked at those fins not with fear, but with a sense of partnership, of shared purpose. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Maria, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. I'm so proud of you, she said softly. Matteo put his arm around her, pulling her close. I couldn't have done it without you, querida. Without any of you. As they stood there, watching the orcas breach and play in the distance, Matteo reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. It had been a path filled with fear, struggle, and near tragedy. But it had also been a journey of discovery, of pushing boundaries, and ultimately, of finding harmony where once there was only conflict. The Patagonian Sea had challenged them, pushed them to their limits. But in doing so, it had also revealed a profound truth, that the key to survival, to prosperity, lay not in domination, but in cooperation. In recognizing the intelligence and worth not just in themselves but in the creatures they shared this vast ocean with. As the sun began to set, painting the sky and sea in brilliant oranges and pinks, Matteo Alvarez felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow, he would set out on the Esperanza once again. But this time he wouldn't just be a fisherman. He would be a steward of the sea, a bridge between two worlds. And as he watched an orca leap from the water silhouetted against the setting sun, Matteo smiled. The future, he realized, was full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, he couldn't wait to see what it would bring. The gentle lapping of waves against the shore provided a soothing backdrop as Matteo Alvarez stood on the beach, his weathered hands shoved deep into the pockets of his old fishing jacket. The early morning mist was just beginning to lift, revealing the vast expanse of the Patagonian Sea stretching out before him. 6 months had passed since the official endorsement of the ORCA cooperation program, and life in Puerto Deseado had settled into a new rhythm. Matteo inhaled deeply, the salty air filling his lungs. Despite the peacefulness of the moment, he couldn't shake the lingering anxiety that had become his constant companion. The memories of those terrifying encounters with the orcas still haunted him, lurking in the corners of his mind and invading his dreams. "Papa," a soft voice called from behind him. Matteo turned to see his daughter, Elena, approaching. At 13, she was growing into a young woman, her face a perfect blend of his features and Maria's. "What are you doing out here so early?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. Matteo managed a small smile. "Just thinking, mija, watching the sea." Elena studied her father's face, concern evident in her dark eyes. "You're worried about going out today, aren't you?" Matteo sighed, marveling at his daughter's perceptiveness. "A little," he admitted. "It's still hard sometimes remembering what happened." Elena slipped her hand into his, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "But it's different now, Papa. The orcas, they understand. They're not the enemy anymore." Matteo nodded, feeling a swell of pride at his daughter's wisdom. "You're right, of course. It's just old fears are hard to shake." They stood in companionable silence for a few moments, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the last wisps of morning mist. "Will you take me out with you someday?" Elena asked suddenly. "I want to see the orcas up close to understand what you've been doing." Matteo felt a flicker of panic at the thought of his daughter out there, so close to the massive predators. But he pushed it down, reminding himself of how far they'd come. "Maybe someday, mija, when you're a bit older." Elena opened her mouth to protest but was interrupted by a familiar voice calling from up the beach. "Hey, Matteo, you planning to stand there all day, or are we going fishing?" Carlos was approaching, his round face split by a wide grin. Despite everything they'd been through, his friend's unwavering optimism never failed to lift Matteo's spirits. Coming, Matteo called back, turning to Elena. "Duty calls, mija. Tell your mother I'll be back before dinner." Elena nodded, giving her father a quick hug before heading back towards their house. Matteo watched her go, marveling at how quickly she was growing up. "She's becoming quite the young lady," Carlos observed as Matteo joined him. "Soon you'll be beating the boys away with a stick, eh?" Matteo groaned good-naturedly. "Don't remind me. I'm not ready for that yet." As they made their way to the docks, Matteo felt the familiar mix of anticipation and apprehension building in his chest. No matter how many successful trips they'd had since implementing the new system, a part of him always braced for the worst. The Esperanza bobbed gently in her berth, her faded blue paint gleaming in the morning sun. Matteo ran a hand along her hull, feeling the familiar curves and imperfections. This boat had been through so much with him, had carried him through the darkest days of the Orca crisis. She was more than just a vessel. She was a testament to their resilience. "Ready?" Carlos asked as they boarded, his voice gentle. He knew, better than anyone, the internal struggle Matteo faced each time they set out. Matteo took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Ready?" As they cast off, Matteo felt the tension in his body begin to ease. The familiar motions of guiding the boat out of the harbor, the gentle rise and fall of the waves beneath them, all worked to calm his nerves. This was where he belonged, out here on the open water. They made their way to the designated fishing zone, the new sonar equipment humming softly in the background. It was strange, Matteo thought, how quickly the extraordinary could become routine. What had once been a terrifying ordeal, watching for orcas, coordinating their movements, had become just another part of their daily routine. As they began to deploy their nets, Carlos broke the companionable silence. "You know, I was talking to Dr. Vega yesterday. She says the program's success is drawing attention from all over the world. Marine biologists, conservationists, they're all interested in what we're doing here." Matteo nodded, a hint of pride warming his chest. "It's hard to believe sometimes that our little town could be at the forefront of something so important." "Believe it, amigo," Carlos said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You should be proud. None of this would have happened without you." Matteo shook his head, embarrassed by the praise. "It wasn't just me, it was all of us. You, Dr. Vega, the whole community. We did this together." As the morning wore on, their nets began to fill with a respectable catch. The new system, while not as bountiful as the old days, provided a steady and sustainable yield. More importantly, it allowed them to work without the constant fear of attack. It was just past noon when they heard the first telltale exhalation, the distinctive sound of an orca surfacing nearby. Mateo felt his heart rate quicken, his body tensing instinctively. "Easy, Mateo," Carlos murmured, noticing his friend's reaction. "Remember, they're not here for us." Mateo nodded, forcing himself to relax. He watched as a large dorsal fin broke the surface about 100 meters from the boat. It was followed by another, and then another. A pod of orcas, at least 5 or 6 strong, had arrived. "Right on schedule," Carlos remarked, checking his watch. "Time for their lunch, I suppose." They began the now familiar process of preparing the offering, a net full of fish specifically set aside for the orcas. It was a strange feeling, Mateo reflected, to be intentionally feeding the very creatures that had once filled him with such terror. As they lowered the net into the water, Mateo found himself drawn to the rail, watching in fascination as the orcas approached. Their movements were graceful, purposeful, displaying none of the aggression he had once associated with them. The largest orca, a male with a towering dorsal fin, approached the net first. With a flick of its powerful tail, it dove beneath the surface. There was a moment of churning water, and then the orca resurfaced, the net torn open and fish scattering in all directions. What followed was a display of coordination and intelligence that never failed to leave Mateo in awe. The orcas worked together, herding the escaping fish and taking turns to feed. There was no fighting, no competition, just a well-oiled machine of nature at work. "Incredible, isn't it?" Carlos said softly, coming to stand beside Mateo. "Sometimes I still can't believe we're seeing this." Mateo nodded, unable to tear his eyes away from the scene. "I know what you mean. After everything that happened, to be here now, watching them like this, it's like a dream." As the orcas finished their meal, they began to swim lazy circles around the Esperanza. Mateo found his gaze drawn to one in particular, a female with a distinctive white patch on her back. Something about her seemed familiar. "Carlos," he said slowly, "does that one look familiar to you?" Carlos squinted, following Mateo's gaze. "Now that you mention it, yes, I think I've seen that marking before." "Why?" Mateo's mind raced, back to that terrifying day, to the moment when he had locked eyes with an orca just before it rammed his boat. I think that might be the one from that day. The one that attacked us." A chill ran down his spine at the realization. Here, mere meters away, was the very creature that had nearly ended his life. But instead of feeling fear, Mateo was surprised to find himself filled with a sense of wonder. "If it is her," he mused, "then she's learned. She's adapted, just like we have." Carlos nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's the real miracle here. Not just that we've learned to coexist, but that we've both changed, grown." As the orcas began to move away, apparently satisfied with their meal, Mateo felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The fear that had been his constant companion for so long seemed to dissipate, replaced by a profound sense of connection to these magnificent creatures. They spent the rest of the afternoon finishing up their catch, working in companionable silence. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, they turned the Esperanza towards home. The docks were busy when they arrived, other fishing boats returning with their day's catch. Mateo spotted Dr. Vega waiting on the pier, clipboard in hand. She had become a regular fixture in their lives, continually monitoring and adjusting the program to ensure its success. "Buenas tardes, gentlemen," she called as they tied up the Esperanza. "How was today's outing?" "Productive," Mateo replied, surprised to realize he truly meant it. "The orcas came right on schedule. No issues at all." Dr. Vega beamed, jotting something down on her clipboard. "Excellent. And how are you feeling about it all, Mateo? I know these encounters haven't been easy for you." Mateo paused, considering the question. "You know," he said slowly, "I think today was a turning point. Seeing them up close, watching how they've adapted to this new system, it's helped me see them differently." Dr. Vega's expression softened. "I'm glad to hear that, Mateo. You're perspective, your experiences. They're invaluable to this program. You've come so far. As they unloaded their catch, Matteo found himself replaying the day's events in his mind. The grace of the orcas, the harmony of their feeding ritual, the realization that the very creature that had once attacked him was now peacefully coexisting alongside their fishing operations. It all seemed surreal. "Papa!" Elena's voice cut through his thoughts. She was running down the dock, her face alight with excitement. "How was it? Did you see the orcas?" Matteo couldn't help but smile at his daughter's enthusiasm. "We did, mija. They were incredible." Elena's eyes widened. "Tell me everything." As they made their way home, Matteo recounted the day's events to his daughter, marveling at how different his perspective was now compared to just a few months ago. The fear and anxiety that had once dominated his thoughts were giving way to a sense of wonder and respect. Maria was waiting for them when they arrived home, the smell of her famous fish stew filling the air. As they sat down to dinner, Matteo found himself overwhelmed with a sense of gratitude for his family, for his community, for the sea that had challenged him but ultimately led him to this new understanding. "You seem different tonight," Maria observed, reaching across the table to take his hand. "More at peace." Matteo squeezed her hand, nodding. "I think I am." Today, out there with the orcas, something changed. I saw them differently. Saw myself differently. As the evening wore on and Elena went to bed, Matteo and Maria sat on their small porch, looking out over the moonlit sea. The sound of waves against the shore provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if we hadn't found a way to work with the orcas?" Maria asked softly. Matteo was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think about how close we came to losing everything. Our livelihood, our way of life. Maybe even our lives." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But then I think about what we've gained. This new understanding, this connection with the sea and its creatures. It's changed us, Maria. Changed me. And I think it's for the better." Maria leaned her head on his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "I'm proud of you, mi amor, of how far you've come." As they sat there, enjoying the peacefulness of the moment, Matteo's mind drifted to the future. He thought about Elena's request to join him on the Esperanza, to see the orcas up close. The idea still made him nervous, but not in the same way it once had. Now it was the nervous excitement of sharing something precious, something profound, with his daughter. "I think," he said slowly, "I might take Elena out on the boat soon, let her see what we've accomplished." Maria lifted her head, surprise evident in her eyes. "Are you sure? I know how worried you've been about her safety." Matteo nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm sure. It's time she saw for herself what's possible when we learn to coexist, to respect the balance of nature." The next morning, Matteo woke early, his mind already racing with plans for the day ahead. He made his way down to the docks before sunrise, wanting some time alone with his thoughts before the day's work began. As he stood there watching the first rays of sunlight paint the sky in brilliant hues, he heard footsteps approaching. Turning, he saw Dr. Vega making her way towards him, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. "Buenos dias, Matteo," she said, offering him one of the cups. "I thought I might find you here." Matteo accepted the coffee gratefully. "Buenos dias, doctor. You're up early." Dr. Vega smiled, taking a sip from her own cup. "Lots to do. We've got a group of international researchers arriving next week. They're eager to see the program in action." Matteo nodded, a hint of pride warming his chest. It's still hard to believe sometimes that what we're doing here could have such a big impact. "Believe it," Dr. Vega said firmly. "What you and this community have accomplished is nothing short of revolutionary. You've shown that it's possible to find balance, to coexist with nature in a way that benefits everyone." They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching as the town began to come to life around them. Fishermen made their way to their boats. The smell of fresh bread wafted from the local bakery, and in the distance the distinctive exhalation of orcas could be heard. "You know," Dr. Vega said thoughtfully, "when I first came here, I wasn't sure this would work. The idea seemed so out there, but watching this community come together and make it happen, it's been inspiring. Matteo felt a lump form in his throat, touched by her words. We couldn't have done it without you, Doctor. Your expertise, your guidance, it made all the difference. Dr. Vega shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. I may have provided the science, Matteo, but you provided the heart. Your courage, your willingness to look past your fear and see these creatures for what they truly are. That's what made this program successful. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, more fishermen began to arrive at the docks. Matteo saw Carlos approaching, his round face split by his usual cheerful grin. Ah, a meeting of the minds, Carlos called out as he reached them. Planning world domination, are we? Matteo chuckled, shaking his head at his friend's antics. Just discussing the visiting researchers. Apparently, we're going to be famous, amigo. Carlos puffed out his chest in mock pride. Famous? Ha! I've always known I was destined for greatness. As they laughed and joked, Matteo felt a sense of contentment wash over him. This was his world, the sea, his friends, his community. And now, improbably, the orcas had become a part of that world too. The day passed in a blur of activity. Matteo and Carlos made their usual fishing run, the encounter with the orcas now a routine part of their day. As they worked, Matteo found himself watching the massive creatures with a newfound appreciation. Their intelligence, their grace, the complex social structures that governed their behavior. It was all endlessly fascinating. As they were heading back to port, Matteo made a decision. Carlos, he said, turning to his friend, I think I'm going to bring Elena out tomorrow. Let her see the orcas up close. Carlos's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Are you sure, amigo? I know how protective you've been. Matteo nodded, a sense of calm certainty settling over him. I'm sure. It's time she understood what we're doing out here. What we've accomplished. Carlos studied his friend's face for a moment, then broke into a wide grin. Well, if you're sure, then I think it's a great idea. Elena's a smart girl. She'll appreciate what we've built here. As they docked the Esperanza, Matteo's mind was already racing with plans for the following day. He wanted Elena's first close encounter with the orcas to be perfect, to show her the beauty and complexity of the relationship they'd forged with these incredible creatures. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, Matteo cleared his throat nervously. Elena, he began, watching as his daughter's eyes lit up with curiosity. How would you like to come out on the boat with me tomorrow? Elena's fork clattered to her plate, her eyes wide with disbelief. Really, Papa? You mean it? Matteo nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. I think it's time you saw what we've been doing out there. If you're still interested, that is... Elena let out a squeal of excitement, jumping up to throw her arms around her father's neck. Of course I'm interested. Oh, Papa, thank you. Maria watched the scene unfold, a mixture of pride and concern in her eyes. As Elena chattered excitedly about the upcoming adventure, Maria caught Matteo's gaze. Are you sure about this? She mouthed silently. Matteo gave a small nod, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand reassuringly. He knew Maria shared his protective instincts when it came to their children, but he also knew that this was an important step, not just for Elena but for him as well. That night, as Matteo lay in bed, he found himself both excited and nervous about the day ahead. He thought about how far he'd come, from a man paralyzed by fear to someone eager to share this new world with his daughter. It was a transformation he never could have imagined just a few short months ago. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect conditions for Elena's first trip. As they made their way to the docks, Elena could barely contain her excitement, peppering Matteo with questions about what they might see. Will we get close to the orcas, Papa? How big are they really? Do they make noises we can hear? Matteo chuckled, his daughter's enthusiasm infectious. Patience, mija. You'll see everything soon enough. As they boarded the Esperanza, Matteo felt a familiar surge of emotion. This boat had been through so much with him. The terror of the attacks, the uncertainty of the early days of the program, and now this new chapter of sharing his world with his daughter. They set out, the gentle rocking of the boat soothing Mateo's lingering nerves. He watched as Elena took everything in with wide-eyed wonder, the vast expanse of the sea, the cry of the seagulls overhead, the occasional splash of a jumping fish. As they neared the designated feeding area, Mateo began to explain the intricacies of the program to Elena. He showed her how the sonar equipment worked, explained the careful balance they maintained with their catches, and described the behavior patterns they'd observed in the orcas. Elena listened intently, her sharp mind quickly grasping the complex interplay between human activity and marine life. "It's like a dance, isn't it, Papa?" she said thoughtfully. "Us and the orcas, moving together, each playing our part." Mateo felt a surge of pride at his daughter's insight. "That's exactly right, mija. It's all about finding the right balance, the right rhythm." As they prepared the offering for the orcas, Mateo could sense Elena's growing anticipation. He remembered his own fear and anxiety during those first encounters, and marveled at how different his daughter's experience would be. "Look, Papa!" Elena's excited cry drew his attention. In the distance, the first dorsal fin had broken the surface. Mateo moved to stand beside his daughter at the rail, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Watch closely, mija. You're about to see something truly special." As the orcas approached, Mateo felt Elena tense slightly under his hand, but there was no fear in her eyes, only wonder and excitement as she watched the massive creatures glide through the water with effortless grace. The feeding ritual unfolded before them, the orcas working in perfect coordination to herd and catch the fish. Elena watched in awe, gasping in delight as one of the younger orcas leapt clear of the water in a spectacular breach. "They're so beautiful," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the scene before her. "And so smart. I can see why you fought so hard to find a way to work with them, Papa." Mateo felt a lump form in his throat, overwhelmed by the moment, seeing the orcas through his daughter's eyes, sharing this experience with her. It brought home just how far they'd come, how much had changed. As the orcas finished their meal and began to swim lazy circles around the boat, Mateo pointed out the female with the distinctive white patch. "See that one, Elena? I think she might be the very same orca that attacked our boat all those months ago." Elena's eyes widened. "Really? But she seems so peaceful now." Mateo nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's the miracle of what we've accomplished here, mija. We've found a way to turn conflict into cooperation, fear into understanding." As they turned the Esperanza towards home, Elena's excitement was palpable. She couldn't stop talking about what she'd seen, asking questions and making observations that impressed Mateo with their insight. "Papa," she said, as the coast of Puerto Deseado came into view, Do you think I could learn to do what you do someday? To work with the orcas to help keep this balance?" Mateo felt a complex mix of emotions at his daughter's question. Pride, hope, and yes, a lingering trace of fear. But looking at Elena's eager face, seeing the passion and understanding in her eyes, he knew there was only one answer he could give. "Of course, mija," he said, pulling her into a one-armed hug. "If that's what you want, I'll teach you everything I know. And who knows? Maybe someday you'll teach me a thing or two." As they docked the Esperanza, Mateo saw Maria waiting. On the pier, her face a mixture of relief and curiosity, Elena raced down the gangplank, bursting with excitement to share every detail of their adventure with her mother. Mateo followed more slowly, taking a moment to run his hand along the Esperanza's hull. This boat, this sea, these magnificent creatures, they had all played a part in the journey that had brought him to this moment. A journey from fear to understanding, from conflict to cooperation. As he joined his family on the dock, listening to Elena's animated retelling of their day, Mateo felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The sea that had once filled him with terror now represented possibility, hope, and a future brighter than he could have imagined. He looked out over the water, catching a glimpse of a distant dorsal fin breaking the surface. In that moment, Mateo Alvarez knew that while the scars of the past would always be with him, they no longer defined him. Instead, they were a reminder of the incredible capacity for change, adaptation, and growth in both humans and orcas alike. As the sun began to set, Painting the sky and sea in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Matteo put his arms around his family. Together they watched the day draw to a close, each lost in their own thoughts but united in their appreciation for the delicate balance they had helped to create. The Patagonian sea stretched out before them, vast and mysterious, holding challenges and wonders yet to be discovered. But whatever the future might bring, Matteo knew they would face it together. As a family, as a community, and as stewards of this remarkable underwater world they now shared with their once feared, now respected orca neighbors. And as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Matteo Alvarez smiled, feeling truly at peace for the first time in years. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but standing here with his family by his side and a new understanding of his place in the grand tapestry of life, he knew that every step had been worth it. The orca saga that had begun in terror had transformed into a tale of coexistence, adaptation, and hope, a legacy that would ripple out far beyond the shores of Puerto Deseado, inspiring generations to come to seek harmony with the natural world around them.